Holy moly bagoli. I've got a Jupiter 8 in the studio. Huge thanks to Shadowchild for the very generous loan. Now, this is one of the holy grail synthesizers. Some say the best analog polysynth of all time. Others say it's massively overrated. In this video, I hope to shed a bit of light on whether it is either or neither of those things. I also want to discuss why it sounds the way it does, but first, here's a couple of patches. So the first reason that the Jupiter sounds the way it does is because of its concept. On the Roland website there is an interview, which I've linked in the description, with some of the original engineers, Kazuhisa Takahashi, Hideki Izuchi, and Akira Matsui. Takahashi explains the concept for that product was to make the best synth there was, so we didn't pay any attention to cost. And indeed the cost was high. In the UK it was £3,995, approximately £15,500 in today's money, and in the US it was $5,295, approximately $15,500 in today's money. Funnily enough, with vintage synth sales hitting fever pitch right now, they have been known to reach 15 grand plus despite being 40 years old. I know a number of people who own Jupiter 8s and they all bought them years ago after they were popular, but before widespread nostalgia had set in, and so what they paid for them would make you weep with jealousy. For example, here's a 1994 guide that recommends a price of between £550 and £700, which even adjusted for inflation is the equivalent of paying between £1,100 and £1,400 now. Gah, we all missed the boat, didn't we? But crazy prices aside, because of the design concept, they are as serious an instrument now as they were in 1981. The next reason that the Jupiter 8 sounds the way it does is the oscillator design. These are analog voltage-controlled oscillators made from discrete components, transistors, op-amps, diodes and capacitors. The only reason that this is noteworthy is that this was 1981, and whilst these kind of designs were the mainstay of 60s and early 70s electronics, by the late 70s integrated circuits were widely in use and were more compact and convenient. I don't know whether Roland decided against using, for example, SSM or SEM chips because they wanted the design to be entirely theirs, or whether there were other reasons or factors, but had they used off-the-shelf third-party VCO ICs, this would have given the Jupiter exactly the same oscillator sounds as various other synths. Another thing I want to talk about are the low-pass filters. These are integrated circuits, but they're Roland's own ICs, IR3109s to be precise, one for each voice. The filters are switchable between 24 dB and 12 dB per octave, or 4-pole or 2-pole if you prefer. According to Florian Anvonder's very handy website that I've linked, the 12 dB response is achieved by picking the signal after the second OTA stage, so these are not separate filters or anything of that nature. There is also a basic high-pass filter as well, which isn't resonant or voltage controlled. Now, talking about the filter sound in action, what's interesting is that depending on how you're using the key modes and the LFO, the Jupiter can be in mono, and when it is, the sound is not a million miles away from a sequential profit. I was expecting a bigger difference. I'll show you what I mean. So it's not identical, there are differences, particularly in the sound of the resonance and the upper mids, and obviously once you start building up full patches with modulation and everything, of course the differences become more evident. But on just the raw sound with basic settings, they can sound quite like each other. However, a big reason that this isn't a fair comparison is that a sizable part of the Jupiter sound are the key modes, particularly the split with variations or even completely different sounds on the left and right, and also the stereo movement you get from the LFO in any of the modes. Now, using that same demonstration again, and make sure you're listening in stereo, this is what a Prophet can't do. There's also a dual mode where the patches are stacked, but the polyphony drops to 4, as you now have 4 VCOs per voice instead of 2. And the Unison mode is interesting because you can still play polyphonically, it's just that the Jupiter will dynamically assign voices depending on how many notes you're holding down, so that all 16 oscillators always sound regardless of whether it's 1 note, 2 notes, 3 notes, etc., all the way up to 8. So there was a closer look at the Jupiter 8. I'm going to play us out with a contextual demo as ever in a moment, but before I did that, I wanted to give a summary of my thoughts, having had a Jupiter in the studio for a couple of weeks. So it looks amazing, it sounds fantastic, but what struck me while I was playing it was that I looked up at all this gear here, and it dawned on me that this is worth more than I paid for all of that in its entirety. And it's not like that is a load of cheap tat. There's a flipping Prophet and a Juno and a System 100M and all sorts in there. And it kind of hit home to me that really only the part of the money you would pay for a Jupiter 8 covers what it actually is. No 8-voice polysynth with this architecture is worth 5 figures. It's all to do with the cultural meaning and significance of Jupiter 8. That's what you're paying for. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a bit like there's only a certain value a Fender Stratocaster would have, but Jimi Hendrix Fender Stratocaster, well, the price will be whatever the price will be, whatever people are willing to pay. And likewise with the Jupiter, demand is up here and supply is right down here. And so, in fact, it's inevitable that the prices are what they are, but it definitely sounds fantastic and is really inspiring to work with. If I had the money and the space, of course, I would own one. But it's been a wonderful, wonderful experience to have one in my studio for a couple of weeks. So huge thank you to Shadow Child. I shall miss this when it goes. And thank you for watching.